Immediately asserting central control, this pawn advance opens diagonal lines for bishops and prepares further pawn expansion. Developing the knight to f6 prepares to contest the center and opens lines for the king's bishop, establishing a flexible pawn structure. Securing central space and preparing to expand on the queen side, this move immediately stakes a claim for territory. Preparing to fianchetto, the bishop offers dynamic counterplay, potentially challenging the central pawn structure for active piece development. Developing the knight here fortifies the center and prepares for kingside castling, a standard part of White's king's Indian defense strategy. Developing the bishop to this square creates a formidable battery along the long diagonal, ready to challenge White's central pawn structure. Solidifying the center and preparing a kingside fianchetto with minimal risk, this offers a flexible pawn structure. Securing the monarch with swiftness ensures king safety, a cornerstone of sound development while preparing for central expansion. This development calmly prepares for kingside castling, harmonizing pieces toward the center. Solidifying the pawn structure, d6 prepares to activate the queen's bishop and supports potential central expansion, while preventing immediate tactical threats against the f7 square. Reinforcing the center's central pawn and preparing to deploy the queen's knight, White asserts greater dominion over key squares, particularly the ambitious e4 outpost Black might later covet. Unhinging the knight's protection of the e-pawn by developing the bishop to this square invites a strategic challenge. Can Black maintain the pawn's integrity, or will this outpost become a target for White's increasingly centralized pieces? Challenging the pawn structure, the queen eyes the b7 outpost and aims to disrupt Black's harmonious development by potentially targeting the isolated c6 pawn if it ever arises, while also preparing for queenside expansion. Consolidating the queenside pawn structure now allows Black to prepare a potential queenside expansion, creating a more solid foundation against White's central presence. Pushing the pawn forward ignites a strategic battle on the queenside, aiming to restrict Black's bishop and gain crucial central space. Pushing the pawn to the edge seeks to disrupt White's queenside expansion and potentially create a pawn majority on the flank, though it also weakens the b5 square and could leave the queenside slightly exposed if not properly supported. The knight embarks on an ambitious journey, aiming to disrupt Black's pawn structure and potentially create a powerful outpost on c6, while also preparing to join the queenside attack and exert pressure on the weak squares that might arise. Reorienting the bishop away from the d5 pawn's influence now sets up potential pressure along the c8 h3 diagonal and prepares for future pawn breaks like e5. Securing the king with a castling maneuver allows White to bring the rooks into play efficiently, aiming to exploit the open files that may soon appear. This proactive step prepares for a more active middle game by centralizing the monarch and connecting the heavy pieces. The knight hops to the edge, eyeing the queenside expansion, a subtle bid to contest White's spatial advantage and prepare for potential breaks. Repositioning the queen to d1 creates a new potential battery along the d-file, also freeing up the c3 square for potentially developing the knight elsewhere if needed, while simultaneously reinforcing the central d4 pawn and preparing for potential central pawn breaks like e4. The knight's journey to c5 injects new life into Black's position, aiming to dislodge White's advanced d5 pawn and potentially create weaknesses on the queenside. This repositioning actively contests the center and opens up lines for other pieces, hinting at a more dynamic middle game struggle where Black seeks to exploit the long-term imbalance created by White's pawn advances. Shifting the bishop to f3, White now aims to solidify control over the central dark squares and prepare for a potential kingside assault, while also creating a defensive screen for the king should the center open. A strategic repositioning unfolds, rerouting the knight from the kingside to a more active outpost on c5, aiming to exert pressure along the queenside and potentially challenge White's central control, while also preparing for future queenside expansion. Unlocking the queenside pawn structure with this advance signals a desire to gain space and prepare for potential breakthroughs, but it also creates a potential weakness on b3, drawing attention to the queen's earlier repositioning and now leaving the c3 knight less supported. Unleashing a pawn thrust, black challenges white's central control and attempts to break free from the cramped queenside, aiming to disrupt the smooth coordination of white's pieces and potentially open lines for counterplay. This pawn thrust dramatically opens the e-file, creating immediate tactical possibilities and forcing a decision for black's bishop on g7, which had previously been a staunch defender of the kingside. White is essentially initiating a central pawn storm, aiming to exploit the potential weaknesses that arise from black's decision to capture or retreat. The exchange also creates an isolated d-pawn for white, which could become a target, but the immediate pressure on black's position is the more striking consequence. The knight now occupies a prominent central outpost, creating an immediate dilemma for white's queen and undermining the pawn chain. Recentering the rook on the kingside creates a more flexible network, preparing for potential pawn advances or supporting a centralized piece. Black is opting to simplify, trading a knight for a bishop and clearing a path for the rook on the c-file, potentially opening lines for further activity. This exchange, while seemingly neutral, subtly shifts the pawn structure and frees up the queen on d8, which has been somewhat hemmed in. Consider how this frees the d-pawn and creates a potential outpost for the remaining knight. Opening the e-file after black's knight retreats creates immediate pressure on the d6 pawn and subtly aims to exploit the pawn structure that black has developed, potentially leading to pawn weaknesses down the line. Re-establishing the rook on the open file offers immediate pressure against white's central pawn structure and prepares for potential advances on the kingside. Opening the path for the queen's rook to potentially dominate the central files, this bishop redeployment subtly enhances white's attacking potential while also offering a defensive retreat should black's kingside initiative become too pressing. Reorganizing the bishop to a more active square, this maneuver aims to untangle black's pieces and prepare for potential counterplay on the queenside, while simultaneously seeking to resolve the central tension. The advance of the d-pawn injects immediate tension into the center, cramping black's pieces and potentially creating a passed pawn down the line. This pawn push aggressively challenges the e5 square, forcing black to react and disrupting their previously harmonious piece placement. White is aiming to seize initiative by restricting black's options and gaining more space on the kingside. Repositioning the bishop to its initial square allows black to prepare a more active future for this piece, potentially eyeing the weak light squares around white's king once the pawn structure opens up. Sensing the potential for a kingside siege, white seeks to build a more robust defensive barrier, preventing any immediate cavalry charges or bishop incursions towards their monarch. Initiating a gradual repositioning of the rook, black aims to contest the semi-open e-file, a crucial line that white's pawn structure on d5 currently dominates. This maneuver also prepares to potentially double rooks or shift the rook to the queenside if white's central control weakens. Shifting the queen to d2 aims to redeploy it to a more active diagonal, potentially targeting the kingside or supporting a central advance, while simultaneously preparing for a rook lift to the third rank. Black repositions the queen, seeking to influence the central dark squares and potentially prepare a rook lift along the third rank, a subtle yet important piece of maneuvering that aims to create dynamism amidst white's solid central pawn structure. Pushing the bishop to d4 aims to control key central squares and restrict black's knight's mobility on c5, while simultaneously reinforcing white's d5 pawn and preparing for potential kingside action by opening up the g1a7 diagonal for the queen. Black consolidates the center by bringing the rook to a more active file, eyeing potential breakthroughs. This is a crucial moment where black seeks to improve piece coordination and challenge white's central pawn structure. The rook's move to e8 isn't just about occupying an open file. It's a subtle preparation to potentially support a pawn push on e5 or to prepare for exchanges that might alleviate the cramped feeling on the queenside. Notice how the bishop on g7 is now unblocked and can potentially participate more actively in the game. While white has a slight space advantage, black is methodically working to equalize by creating counterplay and defending key squares. The position remains complex, with neither side having a clear advantage, demanding careful calculation and positional understanding. Suddenly, a major file opens, potentially creating significant attacking chances for white. Reclaiming the queen to the center of the board, black repositions their most crucial piece, preparing for potential skirmishes and consolidating a more active presence amidst the complex pawn structure. This maneuver avoids the isolation of the queen on the edge and offers new attacking avenues, while simultaneously bolstering the defense of the king. The repositioning hints at a shift in black's strategy, perhaps aiming to exploit weaknesses that may arise in white's potentially overextended pawn chain. With the queen now centrally located, it can support advances, defend key squares, and potentially orchestrate counterplay. The open lines created by the recent exchanges can now be more effectively controlled and utilized. This is a dynamic response to white's doubling of the rooks on the e-file, seeking to regain initiative and clarity in the ensuing middle game. Opening up the queenside with this pawn thrust dramatically alters the piece interplay, challenging black's slightly passive setup and seeking to gain a foothold on the queenside by creating weaknesses or open lines for white's rooks. An attempt to break the closed position and gain some breathing room on the kingside, though it does weaken the pawn structure and could invite pressure down the now open h-file if white capitalizes. Shattering the pawn chain opens the queenside considerably, creating a sharp imbalance and forcing black to immediately confront the exposed file, while potentially offering white a central pawn majority in the long run. Opening the queenside flank with this pawn thrust immediately challenges white's pawn majority and aims to unravel the queenside structure, potentially creating an outpost for black's knight on c5 and weakening white's pawn. Initiating a probing advance along the semi-open c-file, this rook's repositioning aims to challenge black's recently established defensive pawn chain and potentially open lines for attacking play should black fail to adequately contest the center. Shifting the king to the h-file is a prudent measure, creating essential breathing room and a potential escape route should central pawns advance further, while simultaneously reinforcing the structure against any immediate pawn storm threats. Consolidating the bishop onto a more active diagonal, this offers a strong defensive posture, preventing any immediate pawn breakthroughs and reinforcing the central control white has been slowly building. Black strategically blocks the queenside advance, aiming to solidify their pawn structure and prevent white from expanding further on that flank. Preparing a potential rook lift, the bishop retreats to a more active diagonal, eyeing the dark squares around black's king and reinforcing the central pawn push. Shifting the bishop back to f5 aims to regain the initiative along the long diagonal, seeking active squares that were previously occupied by the pawns. A bold flanking maneuver, knight to b5 seizes the initiative on the queenside, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and create immediate attacking chances by threatening the c7 square and potentially opening lines. Suddenly, the bishop redeems its earlier confinement, finding a more active diagonal and reasserting its presence on the queenside, aiming to disrupt white's recently established pawn structure and potentially create tactical opportunities through its newfound freedom. Reopening the e-file after the exchange on e7 now aims to exploit the slight positional concessions black made by pushing the pawn, and then allowing white's rook to re-enter the fray, creating immediate pressure along the semi-open column and forcing black to remain vigilant regarding their king's safety and pawn structure. Reclaiming central influence and preparing for a potential queenside expansion, the black queen repositions to a more active role, eyeing the queenside pawn structure and offering support for future piece maneuvers. Solidifying the central pawn structure with this bishop repositioning aims to prevent black's knight from hopping into the favorable c5 square, while simultaneously preparing a potential kingside pawn storm advance later on. The bishop vacates its post on f5, a sensible maneuver aiming to untangle black's pieces and prepare for potential kingside activity or a strategic repositioning of the bishop to a more active diagonal, possibly targeting white's d5 pawn or reinforcing the kingside defense. The bishop redeploys, seeking a more active diagonal to support the pawn advances and exert pressure on black's queenside structure. a bold repositioning to infiltrate the enemy's queenside structure, aiming to disrupt white's pawn chain and potentially create weaknesses on the b4 square. Attempting to re-establish queenside pressure after the earlier pawn exchange, though the knight on e4 presents a significant defensive hurdle. The knight's journey to f6 aims to redeploy from the passive square it occupied, seeking more active participation in the central struggle and offering support to the king if necessary, though it also opens up potential lines of attack for white on the kingside. White abandons the queenside expansion, acknowledging the limitations imposed by black's well-placed knight and the active pawn structure, to regroup the queen for a potential central or kingside initiative, anticipating further maneuvering rather than immediate breakthroughs. A bold repositioning, the knight abandons the cramped queenside to seek active squares in the center, challenging white's piece coordination and aiming to disrupt the pawn structure before it solidifies further. Consolidating the bishop's presence on the kingside and preparing for a potential advance of the e-pawn creates a strong central anchor. Unleashing a pawn storm towards the white king, this aggressive thrust on the kingside aims to shatter the defensive lines and create immediate attacking chances, daring white to respond to this forceful challenge. Preparing to contest the central files becomes paramount after this bishop maneuver, potentially opening avenues for infiltration should the opponent's pawn structure weaken. Re-establishing the bishop on its active diagonal aims to exploit the open files and pressure white's queenside pawns, subtly shifting the battleground away from the cramped kingside. Opening that kingside with a pawn thrust can be double-edged. It exposes your monarch to potential attacks while simultaneously creating attacking chances by freeing up lines. Opening that diagonal for the king is a bold statement, sacrificing pawn structure for potential attacking avenues. The intention is to dismantle white's protective pawn shield and invite chaos, hoping to exploit the exposed nature of the white monarch. It's a gambit of sorts, trading material for initiative, and the hope that the ensuing tactical melee will favor the side with the more active pieces. Opening the h-file offers a tantalizing glimpse of the black king's defenses, but be wary of overextending. The pawn structure is already compromised, and you must remain vigilant against any counterplay black might find on the queenside or through the now exposed central squares. A bold foray into enemy territory, sacrificing material to disrupt white's solid pawn structure and open lines towards the monarch. Unleashing the bishop on d3 now actively contests the open g-file, aiming to dislodge black's beleaguered king from its increasingly exposed position. Unleashing the pawn storm with f5 dramatically alters the kingside's structural integrity, aiming to pry open lines for the bishop and queen at the expense of potentially weakening your own monarch's protection. Unleashing the knight to f3 offers immediate attacking potential, aiming to exploit the exposed black king and open files, while simultaneously bolstering white's central presence. Reactivating the bishop from its passive defensive post on h5 offers a dynamic shift, potentially targeting the now exposed kingside and challenging white's centralized pieces with renewed activity. Sacrificing the bishop opens lines for white's remaining pieces, aiming to exploit black's suddenly exposed king and potentially creating mating threats or forcing further concessions. Embracing the open file, the pawn boldly advances, seeking to disrupt white's centralized pieces and create crucial counterplay on the queenside, potentially isolating the powerful bishop. Reactivating the knight to d4 injects immediate pressure, eyeing the weakened pawn structure on the queenside and threatening a fork if black's bishop shifts unwisely. Shifting the bishop to the f7 square is a crucial step in black's long-term defensive strategy, preparing to contest the open e-file that white has so diligently worked to control. This seemingly passive repositioning is in fact a preparatory maneuver, aiming to neutralize white's piece activity and eventually create counterplay through the now vital central files. It signals a transition in black's thinking from merely surviving to actively seeking equality. Unlocking the queenside pawn structure offers a potential avenue for counterplay and breathing room against black's entrenched pieces. The bishop retreats to its starting square, a subtle yet important regrouping as the position simplifies, potentially setting up a fortress or preparing for an eventual queenside advance after this positional skirmish. The knight's return to its starting square on b5 signifies a strategic pivot, aiming to disrupt black's queenside pawn structure and prepare for potential advances on that flank while simultaneously eyeing the vulnerable d6 square. Shifting the bishop to the g6 square solidifies the queenside and offers the bishop an active diagonal, potentially supporting future pawn pushes or creating threats against white's king if the center opens further. Securing the queen's central influence and preparing to potentially activate the knight on d4 further. Reactivating the rook's defense along the 7th rank, a subtle repositioning that prepares for potential pawn pushes or a more active role in the upcoming middle game skirmishes, while simultaneously bolstering the king's protection. This offers a crucial pivot, seeking to destabilize black's pawn chain by opening the f-file, potentially exposing the king or creating a new avenue for attack. Boldly initiating an assault on the enemy king, this offering of the queen seeks to unravel white's defensive pawn structure and exploit the open file, potentially creating weaknesses around the monarch. A sudden offensive to exploit the open diagonal and expose the king. Trading off the queen here offers a respite from the immediate tactical storms and steers the game towards a more strategic endgame, potentially exposing white's slightly awkward knight placement. Securing the king with the capture is the primary objective, bringing the monarch out of potential danger and preparing for the imminent endgame. Black's bishop repositions, seeking improved activity and potentially setting up a battery on the long diagonal, a subtle shift in positional pressure as the endgame looms. Opening the c-file now offers a direct assault route against black's vulnerable king and potentially cracks open the queenside pawns for further exploitation. The pawn sacrifice on c5 has opened up avenues, and now black, recognizing the opportunity to disrupt white's piece coordination, ventures the bishop to the newly accessible c1 square, aiming to challenge the queen's influence and perhaps initiate a tactical sequence. Clearing the central path, white immediately confronts black's passed pawn, forcing a decisive response that will shape the ensuing endgame. Finally, a glimmer of hope for black as the pawn structure begins to unravel, potentially opening lines for counterplay that were previously non-existent. Reactivating the rook to threaten the c-file opens up crucial attacking avenues and forces black to constantly reassess their defensive posture. Opening up the diagonal for the bishop to actively participate in the upcoming pawn skirmish and potentially target white's weakened queenside structure offers a dynamic counterplay. Recapturing the pawn with the bishop reopens the c-file for your rook and simultaneously sets up a potential discovered attack on black's king should the d-pawn advance further. Black's choice to bring the rook to b7 now is an attempt to reroute it towards the center or perhaps support a pawn push on the queen side. But with white's bishop pair and queenside majority poised to advance, this rook maneuver feels a bit slow to address the immediate threats. Initiating a forcing sequence, this check aims to disrupt black's coordination and potentially expose their monarch. The king's final refuge crumbles as the rook boldly infiltrates, forcing a painful decision. The king's exposed position after the pawn sacrifice is now glaringly apparent, and accepting the rook leads to a decisive material advantage for white. Sacrificing the bishop on c7 to force a queen trade, aiming to simplify into a winning endgame where white's passed pawn on c5 will prove decisive. The capture on f3 completely rearranges the pawn structure, opening a path for white's rook to potentially penetrate further and simultaneously creating a potential passed pawn for black on the king side, albeit one that's currently well defended. Unlocking the passed pawn's potential requires careful king maneuvering to support its advance, as the isolated white monarch now becomes a key piece in the final drive. The black bishop now ventures to a square where it can survey a broader expanse of the board and potentially pressure white's weakened pawn structure. Reasserting pressure on the queen side, this retreat aims to activate the bishop, eyeing potential incursions along the c-file and supporting a future pawn advance. Reclaiming that pawn with the bishop on d5 is a tactical necessity, bringing material equality back to the board while simultaneously reinforcing the defense of the b6 pawn and preparing for potential counterplay on the queen side. Shifting the bishop to f2 prepares a potential advance of the pawns on the queen side, aiming to gain space and possibly open lines for the rooks. The black bishop retreats to its initial square, seemingly a passive repositioning, but it subtly repositions itself to defend the vulnerable pawns and prepare for a potential counterplay along the second rank, aiming to disrupt white's harmonious pawn structure.